Nobody wants to sit in front. Come on up. We're going to have a little production here before we get started in introductions. So come on in, take a seat, and we'll get started, show you a quick little video.
When I look out to this country, I can see a lot of potential. I see what we created by hand. A land wrought from nothing but our imagination. Our innovations that bring us closer to the future. It's our ability to work together that have made us who we are.
It's a tribute from the people who literally built America.
From constructing our city's skylines and the roads that connect them, to the buildings that define us and the utilities that give them life. We've spent the last 100 years sweating the details. Together, we built a legacy this nation can stand on. And we continue to lead with our minds on the future, paving the way for generations to come.
So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome and thank you all for coming. I'm Tim Warkey. I'm the Chief Executive Officer here at AGC of Minnesota. I wanted to start the program with that video, and I'm going to allude to that in a second. But first, I want to take care of a few introductory things here. I want to thank our sponsors of the event today. Our sponsors are Beneke Construction, Bituminous Roadways, Clifton Larson Allen, and PCL Construction Services, Inc. So thank you for your sponsorship. And again, thank you all for coming. So the video we just shown you is the introduction to AGC of America turning 100 years old this October. And they will be celebrating their centennial in Washington, D.C. And why is that significant? That's significant because this chapter, AGC of Minnesota, is the first chapter of AGC in the country. And we will be turning 100 years old in December of this fall. And we're planning a centennial celebration. And you'll see here on the monitors that you'll be receiving a special invitation sometime probably early next week about our kickoff to our 100-year event. And we think we've got some great things in store, but let me tell you a little bit about the event. The event's going to occur on December 11th of this year, 2018, and it's going to occur in St. Paul, at what's called 311 on Main, or 311 on Rice Park, excuse me. And 311 Rice Park is now an event center, but it used to be, I believe, the Minnesota Club, and that's significant for the following reason. On December 11th of 1919, the charter for AGC of Minnesota was signed by 6 contractors in the same building on the same date that we'll be celebrating exactly 100 years. So we want to invite all of you to that event. We've got a lot of things planned throughout the year. We hope it's going to be some good things in store for you. So just want to put that on your radar. I do want to take the privilege and the opportunity for one moment to welcome some special guests of ours and introduce them. First of all, this is by way of thank you. Harry Melander, many of you know, Harry is here. He's in the back. Harry is the president of the Minnesota Statewide Building Trades Council. And Harry is also on the board of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve District. And Harry was very helpful in getting today's presentation established. But I want to have her stand up and introduce to you Carly Moline. Carly is a new person at the Minnesota Building Trades Council. She's their new executive director. And Carly is a face you're going to see around a lot. And she has a history and a background of being in elected office. She was a legislator for a number of years. So we're pleased to have her here, and welcome and introduce yourself to Carly today when you get a chance. So that leads us to our program. And I want to kick it off, first of all, by thanking our guest speaker here today, Neel Kashkari. You all have a copy of Neel's bio. And Neel is the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve District Bank. And he's here to speak to us about a number of things. And he's got some thoughts that we're going to open it up. But this is a participative event. So this is not church. You know, I don't see, you know, there's people, typically you're not in the front, okay? You can't sneak out early, so don't be doing that. But we want you to ask some questions. This industry is involved a lot in matters. You're small businesses, some of you are large businesses. Some of you are small employers, some of you are very large employers. In the economy and monetary policy and things that the Fed do are somewhat mysterious, but they affect us very significantly. So please, while you get a chance, review Neel's bio, but let's just take a minute and welcome Neel Kashkari. So Neel, I think the best way I've seen to kick this off is for me to ask a question. And I think the best way to lead into this for the group is to talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve Bank, maybe a little about its history. Tell us why it's important, what you do, and how as both businesses and individuals, the actions of the Fed have impact on our lives.
Well, Tim, thank you, and all of you, thank you for having me today. I really appreciate the great turnout. And as Tim said, I really do want to make this interactive. I'm here to share with you about the Fed, but I'm also here to listen and to learn from you and answer your questions. And so please don't be shy. I always like to start in explaining what is the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is our nation's central bank. We were created by an act of Congress, and the job basically is to try to manage the ups and downs of the economy. If the economy starts overheating, the Fed will typically raise rates to cool things down so it doesn't get too hot. If the economy is falling, the Fed will typically lower rates to try to boost the economy. And the reason that interest rates matter, as all of you know, is that's where financing comes from. You know, for businesses to get a loan to build a factory or to build a new plant or whatnot, the interest rate they pay actually matters. Now, the interesting thing about the Fed is our nation as a country, we've always hated the idea of having a central bank. It just, you know, Alexander Hamilton created the first central bank. Then they got rid of it. Then they created a second central bank. Then they got rid of it. They hated it because it sounded very undemocratic. A bunch of bankers in a dark room doing God knows what. It just doesn't sound very American. And then in the late 1800s, our economy was hammered with banking crises, especially in the ag sector. And so Congress said, well, even though we hate the idea of having a central bank, I guess we need one. But if we're going to have it, we don't want it concentrated in Washington, D.C., controlled by the executive branch. So that's literally why Congress in 1913 created this unique distributed central bank. So they created the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. You've probably heard of Alan Greenspan was chairman of the board in the 90s, then Ben Bernanke, then Janet Yellen, now it's Jay Powell. And then they created 12 independent regional Federal Reserve banks. So my job, our job at the Minneapolis Fed, is literally to represent all of you. What's called the 9th Federal Reserve District is Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, the Upper Peninsula, Michigan, and northwestern Wisconsin. So part of my job is traveling around our district with my colleagues, having conversations like this, hearing directly from folks like you, and bringing your insights in the local economy back to Washington, D.C. When I go back, we meet every 6 weeks to set interest rates for the nation. So part of my job is to be able to talk about what's happening here in the local economy. And that's why this conversation is so important to me. Now, one more comment. Harry Melander, who's here, is on our board of directors. Another important point just for you to know, our board of directors is made up of local leaders from our community. So Harry is on the board and has been doing a great job for the past 4 years or so, 3 years or so, and he'll be on it for the next 3 years or so, which is terrific. And it's people like Harry who also give us insight into what's happening in the local markets and the local economy, and it's the board of directors that selected me. And so these are like little nuances of government, but it's actually really important because Congress wanted the Fed to be independent of politics, and part of the way we achieve that independence is we have these local reserve banks that are led by local leaders such as Harry. And so that's why I'm here, and that's why I want to hear from you.
I suspect we have some folks that may not want to jump in at this point yet. So can you tell us, Neel, the process that the Fed uses to set interest rates and what you do and what your staff does here locally and what goes into that and the entire process that goes on and how public that is and what you think about when you get together on a regular basis?
Sure. So Congress has given us what you'll read about in the press. It's called our dual mandate, which is Congress wants us to try to balance two goals. One goal is stable prices, so an economy that's not overheating, but also not limping along. The second goal is maximum employment. That means every American who wants to get a job is able to find work. Now, these two goals are related to each other because think of it this way. If the economy is overheating, you might imagine there's a lot of jobs available and everybody's able to find a job. But if the economy is then overheating, we might have to raise interest rates to cool things down a little bit, but then that might hurt the job market. So these two things generally we think of are related through wages. So the way we think it works is businesses are looking for workers, the economy is growing. As the labor market gets tight, businesses have to compete with each other, as I bet you all are, have to raise wages, you pay more, you pass those costs on to your customers, and that shows up as higher inflation. So we're always trying to balance the labor market and inflation to achieve the goals that Congress has set for us. So we're always looking at whatever data we can get our hands on what's happening in the job market. Is there slack in the labor market? So I'll give you an example. The headline unemployment rate that gets a lot of attention in the press was a peak of 10% in the Great Recession in 2009. Nationally, it has now fallen to 4.1%. So the job market has recovered a lot since 2009. Normally, we would have expected that strengthening job market to lead to big wage increases. And then that would in turn lead to inflation. Well, we've seen the job market get stronger, but we haven't seen much wage growth nationally. The latest numbers are around 2.7%. We would have expected stronger wage growth. And then we've also seen low inflation. So we're always looking for more data in terms of, is there still slack in the labor market? Are there still people who left the job market who have as yet not come back in? I think there probably are some. And then what's the outlook for wages? And then what's the outlook for inflation? So when we turn the microphones to you, I would love to hear about what are you finding in terms of available workers. Let me predict something. Many of you are going to say we can't find workers. We're having worker shortages. I hear that everywhere I go. And then I always ask, are you raising wages? And usually the answer is no. And then I say, well, if you want more of something but you're not willing to pay for it, that's called whining, right? That's not. So this is what I want to hear from you in terms of what's happening in your local labor markets. What are you seeing? What are the challenges? Are there folks that we can keep bringing in? Because for the last couple of years, we at the Federal Reserve keep thinking that the economy is approaching maximum employment. Everybody's employed who wants to work. And then we're surprised all these people come out and take jobs. Well, they said they weren't looking and now all of a sudden they're employed. I guess we must not really have been at maximum employment. So we don't yet know for sure, are we there? Is there more slack? Are there more folks who still will work, especially if wages start to climb?
What's the actual?
So we're going to get you a microphone. Just so, because we're live streaming this. We're live streaming this, so just FYI, we're live streaming this. So people will get to hear your question.
Don't let that be a deterrent.
Shane McFadden, ECI. What's the actual unemployment rate?
Well, the official unemployment rate is 4.1% nationally, but that only includes people who who actually are looking for work, who say, yes, I've looked for work in the last month or whatnot. I can't remember what the actual data is. But if you've given up looking for work, then you're not counted in that actual unemployment rate. And I know if we look at different measures of the job market, we're fewer people. We know society is getting older. So more and more people are retiring just as we as a society age. So you would expect the percentage of Americans who have jobs, you would expect it to decline as our society gets older. But even if you look at what we call prime age workers, so 25 to 55, we are lower than we were back in 2007, 2008 in terms of the percentage of prime age workers who have jobs today. That tells me there's probably still some slack in the labor market, people who could work but are right now choosing not to.
I have a couple of questions.
Could you identify yourself?
My name is Jeff Gluckstein. I'm with J.E. Dunn Construction. I have two questions. One has to do with politics, or both are about politics and maybe how they affect money. One is our country's current thought process on our immigration policy, and then recently the tariffs and what you've been able to track and how it started to impact certain material costs that everybody in this room is either trying to buy or build a building with.
Well, first on immigration, and I've spoken about this publicly and written about it a little bit. If we look at where economic growth comes from, it comes from two sources. One source of economic growth is productivity growth. That means new technology, or workers have more skills so you can do more with the same resources. The other source of economic growth is simply population growth. More workers to produce things, more consumers to buy things. Now, our population growth rate has slowed because our fertility rate has gone down. All advanced economies are facing this. The wealthier advanced economies get, generally they're having fewer children than the prior generation. So we know the population growth rate is slowing. So I always say to people, you have three choices, and this is just math. Option number one is we can just accept slower growth because we're not having as many babies as we used to. Option number two is you can do what Japan is trying to do, and they're trying to subsidize fertility. Literally, tax credits to families to have more kids, free childcare, et cetera. Obviously, that's expensive, and it takes a long time to move the needle. Or number three, you can turn to immigration. And those are the three choices. Accept slow growth, subsidize fertility, or embrace immigration. Now, Japan can't do the immigration piece because they're just culturally not welcoming of immigrants in their society, so that's not an option. Well, immigration has really benefited America tremendously throughout our history, and it's available to us because immigrants want to come here. We're not perfect, but we have a very welcoming culture relative to other countries. And so, to me, I think immigration is an important part of our future economic growth, especially as we use up what available slack there is in the labor market. Remind me the second part of your question? Tariffs. So I've watched for the last 20 years how the U.S. has tried to promote free trade around the world and free and fair trade, especially with China. Lots of negotiations, lots of discussion, but I've seen that basically China does whatever China wants to do. So we talk, we nod, we smile, we shake hands, and then they do whatever they're going to do anyway. And so I'm sympathetic with the need to find some way of pushing them to open their markets to U.S. businesses. And that's what I think is motivating the current dialogue with China and the current discussion of tariffs. Now, I will say we have to avoid a trade war. I mean, an all-out trade war will be enormously bad for the 9th District, where we live here. It'll be enormously bad for the U.S. economy and the global economy. But I also recognize we do have to find some way of pushing them to open their markets. You know, when an American business typically wants to do business in China, China will say, sure, welcome. you just need a 50% joint venture partner in China. Or, sure, you want to sell in China, build a factory in China. Well, we don't do that. We don't impose those requirements on other countries. And I'm not suggesting that we should, but we do need to try to find a way to level the playing field. But it's very hard to game out where this ends up.
John Kittleson, Bituminous Roadways. Is this on? John Kittleson, Bituminous Roadways. Thanks for being here. You kind of started off right down the path of a question I've had and have not been able to find the answer, and that is full employment and the numbers that constitute the base work for that. Now, I know that number's been adjusted over time. So in other words, if you're at 4.1% now, I think you said, so if we're at 0% and you are counting that full employment, there's still people that don't want to work. What are those numbers? How do they get adjusted, and can they ever be reversed?
What do you mean, can they ever be reversed? What does that mean?
Can they ever go the other way? So if they make the adjustments that there's more people that don't want to work, so they're not counted in that pool, can we get to will the Fed look at that and say, okay, can we get more people that do want to work and go the other way with that?
Yeah, we look at a lot of different measures to try to assess the labor market. So one is this unemployment rate that I talked about, which is people who are actively looking for work. We look at other measures where people have said, I'm not looking for work. I don't have a job and I'm not looking. And sometimes people do that because they're retired. Sometimes they say that because they're in school. Sometimes they say that because they're on disability. So we look at a lot of different measures to try to get an overall sense of, are we at full employment? How close are we? We know that headline number can never be zero. There's always transitions that are taking place in the economy, people moving and whatnot. But how low can it go before it starts leading to inflationary pressure? We're really not sure. But we do think that our assessment is that there's something called the rate below which inflation takes off. So we used to think it was around 5%. Now we think maybe it's closer to 4.5%. Maybe it's even lower than that. We're not exactly sure. So this is an example where we don't know, this is not an exact science. We have to look at a lot of different measures to try to get a sense of what's happening in the labor market. Now, one last comment. Generally speaking, if we're trying to assess supply and demand in a market, the best way to assess supply and demand in the market is look at what's happening to the price. So if you want to assess supply and demand in a market, if the price is accelerating, then you're probably using up all the available supply. Well, wage growth is not very high in America. That tells me there's probably still more slack than the headline numbers actually suggest. If we were seeing a 4.1% headline unemployment rate with really strong wage growth, that would tell me, hey, maybe we're there. But the fact that we're seeing a 4.1% unemployment rate with modest wage growth tells me we're probably not there yet.
Alexis Miller with Advanced Masonry Restoration. My question is more so the labor market and unemployment rate can be rather vague. So what I'm wondering is do you have data, or do you look at that in terms of industry specific? For example, very specific would be the trades industry, and how that compares to also union labor rates.
So I don't have that data off the top of my head, but we do look at it by various sectors. We do know, as an example, if you look nationally, manufacturing employment has declined over the past 40 or 50 years, even though the production of manufacturing has gone up because productivity has gone up so dramatically. And there's also trade reasons as well. But so we do look at it by sector, but I don't know off the top of my head what the different sectoral unemployment rates are. And we also do look at wage growth across various sectors. So if you look at that 2.7%, I said is the national average hourly earnings growth rate annual, it's very varied across industry and across sector. It's much lower for, let's say, the entry-level laborers than it is for the engineers or the scientists, as an example. So we do look at it, but I don't remember all of the breakdown off the top of my head. Thanks.
Good.
Hi, Trixie Goldberg with Triumph Electrical Services. I'm curious overall where the Federal Reserve gets involved with issues of economic equity, but also curious then about how does engaging non-traditional workforce or retraining help with some of the issues, particularly in the trades? And are there any strategies that are successful in building that specific labor pool? And then the equity question overall.
Sure. So let me start with the latter point. So this is one of the really neat things that we've seen over the past couple of years as the job market has gotten tighter, is that you're seeing businesses do extraordinary things that they would not have done a few years ago, which is, businesses say, I can't find trained workers. Well, now they're starting to train them themselves. And you're seeing more and more businesses saying, you know what, I'll train you. Or this job I used to drug test for, but you know what, you really don't need to do the drug test for this certain job. We won't do it. Or we're going to give somebody who has a criminal background certain jobs that's disqualifying. You know what, maybe it doesn't need to be for other jobs. So you are seeing businesses respond to this tight labor market by doing what's in their own self-interest, which is giving a more diverse group of people a shot. And I think that's unquestionably positive for the businesses and for society as a whole. In terms of what role the Federal Reserve can play, we know that monetary policy, because we have one interest rate for the whole country. We can't set a different interest rate for Minnesota or for the construction industry or for healthcare. It's one interest rate for the whole country. We can't target it. But we are doing a lot of research to try to understand what is leading to these very disparate outcomes and why sometimes growth is not as inclusive as it should be. So literally a year ago at the Minneapolis Fed, we launched a major new research initiative that we call the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute, where we have researchers from around the country coming to Minneapolis to work with us to try to analyze what are the structural barriers to this inclusive growth economy. And even if we can't solve it with monetary policy, if we can equip legislators with the data and the analysis, then potentially they could take it forward, be it state legislators or federal legislators. Thanks.
Yes, my name is Connie Sahibjam. I'm with SRF Consulting, an engineering firm that designs roads and bridges. My main question has to do with the effect of technology on pretty much everything. It's affecting the medical world, the legal world, and our world of transportation. You've heard of autonomous connected vehicles and things like that. And is that something that you are looking into or you're discussing in your world, how it's going to affect the workforce? I mean, we have a lot of engineers that used to design bridges and roads. Now with the technology, I don't think we need that many people. So we need that many engineers, and much less maybe one person can do something really fast. It took a long time in the years ago. My friend is shaking his head, he's agreeing.
So we do talk about this a lot. And one of the, so on one hand, it looks like there should be great optimism about the future and about future productivity growth with all of this technology that's coming. So the one downside is, well, it could be very disruptive for people. For example, truck drivers, if they're replaced by self-driving trucks, that could be very disruptive and very painful for them. The other thing that's interesting is that productivity growth around the world has been very low. So we think we're at a time of big technology revolution, but it's not showing up in our productivity data. Not in the US, not in Europe, not in Asia, not in advanced economies. And so we're not exactly sure. Is this productivity, is this innovation really that transformative, or is it more incremental? And then what does the future hold? We're not exactly sure. I will say this, people have been predicting the end of labor because of automation forever. And they've all been wrong. And so will the nature of jobs change? Probably. But are all of a sudden we're all going to be put out of work because of a bunch of robots? I'm not betting on that.
Hello?
Yep, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Chuck Roundhorse with Roundhorse Recruiting Company. And one of the things I always work about, recruiters do well when we have a growing economy. It's better for my business and for everybody else's, I'm sure, as well. We have this huge debt hanging over America, and we just got through passing more debt. And it's like now we don't talk about it, but a year and a half ago we did. What percentage of that debt is interest? Will the interest rates affect? How does it affect your decisions for interest rates that affect us for growth? And what is it doing to our economy overall that it wouldn't be happening if we didn't have all this debt?
So it's long-term, the debt, the fiscal situation is enormously important to our country, no question about it. We have to make tough choices, and so far we're not making those tough choices. I will say, so the Federal Reserve was designed to be independent of politics. So fiscal policy, how much we're taxed, what those tax dollars are spent on, that's the domain of Congress and the executive branch. The Federal Reserve has been delegated, you guys worry about interest rates, to manage the ups and downs of the economy and employment. So how the Treasury funds itself and how much they spend and what they spend on is not part of our deliberation. We're not going to keep interest rates low to make Treasury's job easy. We're going to manage interest rates the best we can to objectively achieve the goals that Congress has given us. But how much they want to tax or how much Congress wants to tax and what kind of deficit they want to run, that's completely up to them. And literally, it's not part of our deliberation as we think about where we set interest rates. And that's the separation that was designed into this system. Now, but again, long term, no country can live forever growing ever larger and larger and larger deficits. The money has to come from somewhere. Eventually, we're going to have to make tough choices. The thing we have going for us right now is that the U.S. economy is the strongest economy in the world. It's the economy that investors around the world have the most confidence in. That's why they're investing in U.S. treasuries, even though we have these big deficits into the future. But that may not always be the case. And you can imagine if Europe were to get its act together, and now investors say, you know what, Europe looks more attractive, then all of a sudden treasury rates might end up going up, and then that would crimp the U.S. budget.
So is that why I should be a little nervous?
Well, again, we have our challenges in America, no question about it, but I wouldn't trade places our economy with any other economy in the world. Nonetheless, we do need to find a way to make tough political choices, and that's what our political process is meant to address.
Is it possible that you've debated amongst your peers that you should have more control in how the debt is managed and affecting our economy? And if so, how does that come out?
Well, no, we don't. Again, because of the separation that was designed into what the Federal Reserve is supposed to tackle and what fiscal policy is. I mean, fiscal policy is pure, these are political decisions that each of you influence through elections. People you elect, they decide how much to tax, what to spend on. Should you fund defense? Should you fund healthcare? Should you fund education? And what mix? That's literally the definition of politics. And the Federal Reserve is designed to try to be separate from that and just make monetary policy decisions to achieve some of the ups and downs short term over the economy. The Federal Reserve cannot affect the economy over the long term. We can really only affect the economy over the short term.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Scott over here.
Got a question. Scott White with Adolphson and Peterson Construction.
Wait, where are you?
Over here.
Oh, hi there.
Yep. Back on the wage growth question, do you measure the incentive payments and the bonuses and hiring, I guess, payments as well, things like that? Then also, in wage growth, is it also considering the money set aside for pensions and 401ks that are into the trillions? Is that part of that?
My understanding is it is, and it's not the Federal Reserve doing these measurements. There's the Bureau of Labor Statistics and there's the Bureau of Economic Analysis, where they have teams of PhD economists that are always doing these surveys, back testing the surveys, seeing the corrections they need to make, and always trying to improve it. So I don't want to suggest that it's perfect, but I do think some really smart people are doing their very best to capture all of that, including benefits, including healthcare costs that are going up, et cetera. All of that is meant to be included. And we don't look at one wage number. We have a number of different measurements, but all of those measurements are basically saying wage growth is relatively low than it was 10 years ago or so, 10, 12 years ago. Hi there.
Hi, Neil. I have a question. I'm not sure what the Fed's role in it is, and that is around policy for access to capital, in that particularly when we're talking smalls or underrepresented demographics like minorities and women and the tougher access to capital. I think when it comes to interest rates, when somebody is working, particularly in this industry, I know for the people that I work with, they really wouldn't care if they were paying a high interest rate if they could just get the capital. And so does the Fed play a role in that? And if so, what would that be?
Well, we do through our regulation of banks. So one of ours, we haven't talked about this yet, but one of our roles is as a regulator and supervisor of banks. So big bank holding companies, then you've got state regulators, et cetera, that we work with as well. And there's the Community Reinvestment Act that is designed to try to get banks to make sure that they're providing equal access to credit. So one of the things we do is audit banks or examine banks to make sure that they are complying with their CRA requirements and that their CRA programs are effective. And so it is something we care a lot about, and we do use the tools that we have to try to achieve the goals that you're talking about, which is everybody should have access, creditworthy borrowers should have access, not depending on gender or depending on race or ethnicity. Thank you. Let me ask, hold on, and I'll turn to you next, but talk to me about workforce, right? I mean, I'm surprised you all aren't, maybe I made the whining comment and that silenced all of you. Tell me about your ability or inability to find workers and, you know, what are you experiencing? So why don't you go next with whatever question you had, but then somebody else, I want to hear about what's happening with workforce in this region. Go ahead.
My name is Sanchaida. I'm from Mortensen. My question was about the Minneapolis Fed Reserve and what are your top 2 or 3 strategic priorities in the next, I would say, 2 to 3 years?
Well, I think a few things. One is we talked about the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute, this major new research initiative focusing on economic disparities and understanding why those disparities exist and what can be done about it. That's a huge strategic priority. For the last 2 years, a huge priority for us has been the issue of too big to fail banks. The fact that these giant banks in 2008 almost brought down the US economy and what we can do to prevent it. We've actually just released a plan that would really address the too big to fail issue. The question is whether, you know, the political winds are blowing in a deregulatory manner right now. Is there actually support to try to do something about that? But that has been a big priority for us. And then generally, we are looking for important economic policy issues where we can make a contribution. So that's why I weighed in publicly on immigration. We don't control immigration policy. It's not up to the Fed. But I do want to educate people in terms of the economic implications of immigration. So I'm not sitting here making a moral judgment. That's for you to make. I'm just laying out the math of whether or not you want the economy to grow or not and the role that immigration has to play. So I think we're always looking for important economic topics where we can hopefully, in a non-political, non-partisan manner, just say, hey, here's what the analysis shows, and then you can decide what to do with it. I'll give you a specific example, very local. So the city of Minneapolis has enacted a minimum wage increase, as you all know. They put out a request for researchers to study the economic effect of the minimum wage increase. Is it good for workers? Some people say it's unquestionably good for workers. Other people say, well, it might lead to fewer hours. So you get more per hour, but fewer hours. So it's actually an unanswered question in terms of the raw analysis. So they've selected us, and we, over the next 8 years, are going to be studying the economic effects of the minimum wage increase. And what they told us is part of the reason they selected us is because people would trust us to do the analysis fairly. And that's our commitment. We're going to do it honestly. We're going to reveal our methods, reveal our findings, and then the public can decide what to do with it. So that's another example. Okay, so let me ask, go ahead. Yeah.
So Neel, if I can jump in and jump on your question about workforce. So this will help you think, I think, collectively about our membership. We survey our members, and we have for 12 to 13 years in a row now, annually. And we noted this year that the perennial response that scores the highest of concern to contractors is workforce. And it's not just confined to field craft labor. It's professional office, front office people. And that the industry, like other industries, is feeling the pinch for workforce. But you can set that down and go back to the recession. And going into the recession and then coming out of the recession, that the industry lost somewhere around 60,000 jobs. And I believe we just crossed level water of regaining those 60,000 jobs sometime last summer in this market. So something happened that took the time to regain those jobs, and as near as we've looked at it and think about it is that contractors started to work smarter and work more efficiently. And for an illustration, maybe what used to be a 5-person crew is now a 4-person crew. And that could be a reach to technology or other enhancements. But I think in general, and maybe someone has a specific example, but in general, I'm not sure that this industry is different than any other industries like manufacturing or other areas of the economy. But workforce is definitely something that pings very high for our members. So now if somebody's got a question, that was more of a statement.
Or a statement.
So.
Hi, Jim Hoffman Construction, Black River Falls, Wisconsin. I had a tax question for you approaching tax day, but I'll digress first to talk about the labor end of it. For an example, a surveyor, which used to take a full day to survey a 20-acre parcel, with our drone now you can do it in about 2 hours. So we're doing more with less. We're squeezing what used to be, like you said, a 5-man crew into a 4-man. Our 40-ton haul trucks are now 45-ton haul trucks. So we're gaining that productivity, and I do see a resistance of the workforce to do the jobs we're asking them to do. We have a high demand on our workers. Safety, long hours, hard work, travel. People are making lifestyle choices not to enter the trades. Partly, I blame some of the educational system, encouraging 4-year college degrees, and then they graduate with a bunch of debt. I think our industry is failing itself by not advertising itself into the middle schools and high schools and actually making it a lifestyle choice to enter the trades. Follow up on my tax question. The recent federal tax code change with the bonus depreciation for new and used equipment, I think a lot of people in this room took advantage of it. And because of a lot of the uptick that we see in the market, combined with a lack of equipment, before it was a lack of workforce, which was my limiting factor. Now it seems to be that and equipment. Do you have any data that could support that and what you see in the impacts of the federal tax code to actions on the ground?
Yeah, we ask this question a lot, and usually what I've been surprised by is the tax cut has led to a lot of optimism. People feel better about the economic outlook. But most businesses that I speak with, and it'd be interesting if you all disagree, most businesses I speak with do not say this has led to a lot of new investment. Usually they're saying we're waiting, we want to see how things play out before we make any changes. And now with some uncertainty in the international trade environment, people are getting nervous about that. But so usually people don't tell me that they're investing more.
Talk to the equipment salesmen. They were so busy between December 25th and December 31st writing new purchase orders for all the equipment.
But then a counterexample. So that may well, I'm sure you're right. A counterexample to that is I hear that farm equipment dealers are sitting on tons of inventory and farmers are not replacing their combines. So, well, I understand, but my point is if you look at the economy as a whole, you know, certain sectors may be hot in a given month or a given quarter, but other sectors are down. We're looking across the economy as a whole. So far, I'm not seeing it, but I'm not saying you're wrong.
How about wages? I mean, the tax reform put more real money in people's personal pocket because of the reduction in the marginal rates. Do you think there's going to be upward pressure now on interest rates because wages are increasing, that you might have to look at interest rates adjustments because of that?
Well, we're trying to assess what the effect the tax change and the spending bill is going to have on the overall economy, and then that could have an effect on what the Federal Reserve ends up doing. I actually think we've been running low. We have a goal of 2% inflation every year, and we've been coming in low, about 1.5% for the past 5 or 6 years, which has been frustrating to us. We want to hit our 2% mark. I think that the tax cut and the spending might actually boost and help us get to our 2% target. But the big unknown, is it going to lead to a more productive U.S. economy over the long term? That is unclear. Is it just going to lead to we know an economic stimulus, if the government spends more, the economy will temporarily be stronger. We know that. But does that actually going to lead to a stronger long-term economy? That right now we don't know yet.
Neel, to speak to your
question about labor and what we're doing for it. Excuse me, my name is Tim Miller. I'm with Advanced Masonry Restoration. I'm also the representative for the JATC on the Bricklayers Apprenticeship Fund. Approximately 6 years ago, we identified the need that these guys were retiring faster than we were replacing them, and what to do. And so we kind of went outside the box and we hired a recruiter. And what this recruiter does is go around, loads the wagon. Now we're doing all the stuff that people are talking about. We're looking at non-traditional areas. She identified the fact a few years ago that, you know, get the bricklayers out of the back of the hallway where the guidance counselors don't get paid to send them to a four-year college. You know, the bricklayers are back there. Bring us out to the forefront. We're aggressive on those fronts. Social media, attracting the millennials, understanding how the millennials work, which has been a big problem because you take a bunch of guys that are in their 40s and 50s and 60s or that are running the show, and they're looking at these kids, and this kid won't answer you. How many times do you call your kid and they don't pick up? You send them a text, and boom, they're right back at you, right? So these are the aggressive ways that we're going, and with that, we've had fairly good success in that I'm also on the IMI, and they're doing the same thing. That's the International Masonry Institute, the training. They're also doing the same thing. Their emphasis is on recruitment and replacement because of the pension funds. We're probably 15% ahead of them as far as a group bringing in students and then retention-wise. Overall, we're still not replacing them at a fast enough rate, but we're going to the non-traditional areas. We're going into the schools. We're using different medias to attract these new students.
What's happening to wages?
That's interesting because are there any tile guys in the room? Last year we had a couple of tile guys say that, you know, oh my God, if they raise the minimum wage rate to $15 an hour, that's my base rate, or it was too close, and they wanted to raise that. Our rate is a percentage, and as you know, we're an apprenticeship program, so it has to be part of the Dolly program. We have to say it's 65 or 70% as the rates go up until you get to journeyman's wages. So to answer your question, tile came in. They wanted to do an emergency raise the wages because they weren't attracting enough people, or they were training them, they weren't able to keep them. So what happens, just like everybody else, you bring in your apprentices, and then you get into supply and demand. You find out a kid's going to leave, you might bump them outside of it. Journeyman's wages, you know, again, were negotiated. Our next negotiation is next year, and I think then you'll see a significant increase.
Here comes the mic. It's all right. No. So the.
One comment on wages too is that when we go in, many of us in the room here are union contractors, so we're hiring union employees. And when we negotiate a wage with the trades, say it's use 3%, 2.5%, 3%, whatever that is. Well, that doesn't all just settle on the take-home check, because a lot of that may be going to the health coverage and the health costs, pension that I'd mentioned earlier. So that's difficult too, because we may see a take-home check that might only have 1.5% increase, which does not really accurately reflect, you know, where we really need to pay more to get those workers on board in our industry.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I agree with you. All of the benefits, et cetera, all matter, and we do look at those comprehensive measures. You know, one observation I had, if you open the paper lately, you read about worker shortages all the time. The Wall Street Journal had this big thing on, I think it was Elkhart, Indiana, last week, RV manufacturing, and it's like this, it's just a crisis. There are no workers, worker shortage. And it occurred to me that, you know, oil, the price of oil has gone from about $30 a barrel to $60 a barrel in the last few years. Nobody is saying oil shortage. But if workers get a little bit scarce, or you have to pay a little bit more to find them, oh my gosh, it's this crisis, worker shortage. So it's something odd. It's the only market where the moment it gets a little more expensive, everybody screams shortage. And I think there's a psychological element to this that I haven't completely figured out yet. But again, nobody's saying oil shortage, and the price of oil has doubled. the price of labor certainly has not doubled. And yet everybody says worker shortage. I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. It's just an observation.
Hi, Neil. My name is Lynn Pingle, and I've got two different questions that's kind of wrap things up from different perspectives. My company is Mackey Company, but I also operate the Resource Center for MnDOT to help disadvantaged business enterprise. So one of the questions that I do have is going to piggyback off of Barb Lau's question with regards to the funding for minorities and women. And I know you said something specific on a particular program for the community. So I want to drill down a little bit on what the position is for the feds in terms of getting that closer to where we are here on the ground versus all the way up. So I'll let you answer that, and then I'm going to come in from my company, Mackey Company side, for the investor side on my second question.
Well, the Community Reinvestment Act, I think it was first passed, if I'm not mistaken, in 1977, and the idea was to make sure that all communities have equal access to credit. Credit-worthy borrowers can get it. And so individual banks are meant to have programs that they can verify that they are, in fact, living the spirit of that. And then the Federal Reserve, as a regulator of banks and other bank regulators, go in and audit those banks to make sure they are, in fact, doing that. And so that's a very specific program. Beyond that, you know, our institute that I just talked about, our research institute, focusing on understanding these disparities, one of the things, it's a bunch of very smart, pointy-headed academics doing academic research, but we've just launched a community advisory board of leaders in the community to give us feedback. Are we focused on the right issues? What are they seeing day to day in their communities? Where are the big questions that we should focus some of our research expertise to try to answer? So I don't have more specifics than that, but I'd be happy to follow up with you. Amy, standing right next to you, can also help put you in touch with the right folks to be more specific.
And I guess what I'm looking for is obviously that regulation's been around since 1977, and a lot has happened with the economy tanking in the 2000s and such. So again, that's whoever Amy is or wherever Amy is, that's really the information that I'm chasing after, because I deal with minority businesses and women at the lowest level possible. So I want to open those opportunities for them in that aspect and also expand their capacity and their growth. So I'm coming in from that perspective, and that's why I wanted to drill down, and I understand it. And I appreciate it. If you initiated the core of going into the community and really finding out if the 1977 policy truly does apply today, I commend you, because obviously it's very much needed. So my second portion, and maybe this is where the political component is going to come into play, I work with investors overseas, and China being one of them, and the EB-5 visas that's come into light recently, particularly with the incident that happened in Vermont, and obviously historically, because it's not as closely monitored as it should have been, and there was a lot of things that kind of weigh on the wayside. So one, personal position on that, and two, where do you see that heading with this immigration going? Because there are valid, solid investors out there that could truly benefit from the EB-5 program, but obviously with the crisis, tough.
Can you remind me what the EB-5 is?
That's the international visa for investors to come into the United States.
So this is the one where if you can make a big investment,
right, with guaranteed community involvement, workforce increase, investments back into the community from foreign money, and being that U.S. has the highest, most respected in terms of custodial bank or reserves, right? They have that platform and can leverage that. So now I don't want to say restricting, but we're limiting the use of this EB-5, which its original intent was absolutely great, but it got taken advantage of, right? So
I don't know, to be honest, I don't know enough about the EB-5 program to opine on its merits. I do think, you know, if you look around the world at other countries, so Canada is often held up as an example, where they have a skills-oriented immigration program, where they prioritize different jobs that the economy needs. If it were up to me, I would try to prioritize a system that feeds the needs of the economy. And so farmers always talk about needing farm workers to work the fields. I think that should be factored in. You've obviously got high-tech companies who are saying we need more engineers, et cetera. So I think that there are a lot of elements here that could be designed that could meet the needs of the economy, and the EB-5 program certainly could be part of that. But again, these are pure political decisions that the public has to make with their elected representatives.
So we get time for maybe 2 or 3 more. Up here.
First, I just want to say thanks for being here, and it's very encouraging to see the Fed's interest in the construction industry. You've talked a lot about productivity, and you've talked about that in different segments. I'm curious about your thoughts around construction productivity and maybe 3 keys for propelling that or accelerating that into the future.
Well, you know, it's funny you said that, because right before I got here, I had a meeting with my economist talking about trade, and they showed me a chart. If you look at productivity by sector, so the goods manufacturing sector, think about just manufacturing or ag, where you're high volume producing something, productivity is just up and up and up every year. Services productivity is much more muted. And then according to the data, construction productivity is basically nothing. It takes the same number of people. According to the data, you guys can tell me I'm wrong, but according to the data, same number of people to build a house as it took 30 years ago to build a house. So the question is, I mean, I guess I should ask you, what do we do about that? I mean, what is it, prefabbed homes and things like that that could bring more productivity into construction? I don't know. I mean, more productivity, that's how you grow the pie, by having a more productive environment, but I don't know how to do it in construction. Can you bring the microphone to the gentleman?
So I've seen changes in delivery method, BIM, some other tools. I guess I'd be interested from the contractors in the room what they think.
They're not thinking anymore.
In the back.
Hello, my name's Heidi Werland. I'm with PCL Construction. I'm also a trustee on a pension board. And so your comment about how do you get more productivity, okay, that means there's probably, to a certain degree, less people. And then I'm like, oh, well, that impacts my pension, right? The pension fund that I'm on, because how do you, less people, less money going into the pension for the people who are retiring. And so I guess a little bit of a question is, or the question is, how is the Fed sort of looking at the pension funds that are out there, especially the ones that are the defined benefit versus the defined contribution?
So that is an issue where I would put in the domain of fiscal policy, which is, I agree it's a very serious issue. And as our society ages, if you think about our entitlement programs just broadly, they're all basically funded by current workers paying for current retirees. And as that balance gets imbalanced, those programs run into the red. And that's largely what's going to lead to the big fiscal challenges that we have. But that really is, the Fed can't do anything about that through monetary policy.
Right, but is that something that the Fed can start looking at and maybe bringing more to the conversation so that?
I think the answer is yes. There are certain programs, let me just abstract for a second. Certain programs, for example, Social Security, this is analyzed completely. We know analytically how you solve Social Security. You can raise the retirement age, you can increase taxes, you can means test. The options are known. The challenge now is for the country to make political decisions on which of those levers you want to pull to get the program into balance. So I think the answer is yes, but in some cases I think the analysis has already been done. What's left is the public making these decisions.
You asked a lot of questions about lack of wage growth and why are you seeing that? As general, our industry is very competitive. And we have a series of owners that basically says they're going to award to the lowest responsible bidder. So the owners are telling me, you got to be as cheap as you can. So using productivity enhancements and trying to keep wages, getting more for less is kind of our business model. We kind of view ourselves one step better than a farmer. A farmer will plant his crops, harvest them, and deliver them to the market and ask, what are you going to pay me? We're one step better where we say we won't do it for 1 penny less than this on my bid. So inherent in our competitive industry is value to the owners that we're working for, and that steady, always got to be that low-cost producer.
So I get that, and I agree with that. That makes sense. But if all of you were facing these worker shortages that we hear about, your competition would be in the same boat you are. And then if you end up having to pay up to get the workers to do the job, you're not going to be underbid by somebody else because they're not going to have workers either. And so this is, I mean, I guess I'm surprised. I'm not hearing you all tell me there's this great worker, the great Minnesota worker shortage, which is what I expected to find coming in here.
It's here. And being from Wisconsin, doing work in Wisconsin and Minnesota, Wisconsin as a union contractor has had a lot of changes on the legislative end. Right to work, got rid of prevailing wage on the state end. Whether or not that occurs in Minnesota, that's another question.
One last question.
I hate to steal the mic.
You've got it.
I'm going to go back a few years, 1990, thereabouts, plus or minus a year. AGC had launched somewhere in there what they call the STP program. Most of you know that as supervisors training. And it was meant to bring up the bar with our supervisors in the industry. There's two Daves taught the class. Dave Summerhead, who most of you know, Dave Rajis. I probably screwed that name up, but most of you probably don't remember him. One of the classes, and I don't remember who the teacher was, the question came up, do you want to work smarter or do you want to work harder? And there was a faction in the room. And I believe that is very fundamental to what's going on here. You assume that I work 40 hours a week. I probably never worked 40 hours a week.
I don't assume that.
But statistically, that's what goes down.
But no, but we measure in the national statistics, we measure hours per week by worker. And we can look at workers' overall hours, and we look at wages per hour when we're assessing what's happening in the state market.
I'm on a salary. Most people in this room are on a salary. Statistically, you work 40 hours a week. That's what you get credited for. The older people in the room, I'm going to guess, you're averaging 75 hours, 80 hours a week. The younger people in the room, probably a little less than that. And that's what we're finding. We've made a lot of investments on equipment. The equipment's getting bigger. Jim alluded to that. You know, surveying. There's so many things in the tech world where we're making investments. That's driving productivity. But then what we ask of our people, we can't push them like we used to. You can't push the younger people. So we raise the bar with expectations because of investments, but then what we ask of them, we compensate for it with less engagement. And that's what we struggle with in this industry, is how can we get the younger people more engaged to keep up with the competitive world, to raise that bar again, not just asking technology to compensate for it. Does that make sense to you?
It does, but I'll just say, so I appreciate the comment. I will just say, I think every generation thinks the generation that follows them is lazy, okay? My parents said that about me. I'm sure their parents said it about them. And you know what? We all adjust, and life catches up, and we figure out we need to work hard to pay the mortgage and to buy the car, and we get on with it. So I'm more optimistic about the next generation.
So Neel, final thought is yours, and I would throw this out. What can this industry do to be of assistance in the work that you do?
Well, you know, stay in touch with us. So Harry's on our board of directors. We want to know what's happening. We want to know what's happening in the workforce. We want to know what's happening to wages. All of this stuff really does matter a lot. This is the stuff we talk about and think about every single day. So, you know, be a source of information for us. And if you see things that are working, share it. You know, if you see programs that enable you to tap into an untapped workforce, boy, we'd love to hear that, because then I can talk about it when I travel around the district and say, hey, Marvin's doing great things. Check out what Marvin's doing, and maybe other people can copy it. So, you know, be engaged, and we'd very much appreciate it.
So with that, let me put a plug in for Neel and his staff. They have a tremendous research staff there. They're constantly looking, as Neel said, for data and information. One of those portals is through AGC and our survey process. So please, when you see that survey come your way annually, please respond, and please be specific in your answers. So this was a real engaging conversation. We are very fortunate to have this opportunity. So let's thank Neel for his attendance and give him a good hand.